A Christmas Fantasy with a Moral by Thomas Bailey Aldrich. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Ferguson. A Christmas Fantasy with a Moral by Thomas Bailey Aldrich. Her name was Mildred Wentworth, and she lived on the slope of Beacon Hill, in one of those old-fashioned swell front houses which have the inestimable privilege of looking upon Boston Common. It was Christmas afternoon, and she had gone up to the Blue Room on the 4th floor in order to make a careful inspection in solitude of the various gifts that had been left in her slender stocking and at her bedside the previous night. Mildred was in some respect a very old child for her age, which she describes as being 7:30, and had a habit of spending hours alone in the large front chamber occupied by herself and the governess. This day the governess had gone to keep Christmas with her own family in South Boston, and it so chanced that Mildred had been left to dispose of her time as she pleased during the entire afternoon. She was well content to have the opportunity, for fortune had treated her magnificently, and it was deep satisfaction after the excitement of the morning to sit in the middle of that spacious room with its 3 windows overlooking the pearl-crusted trees in the common, and examine her treasures without any chance of interruption. The looms of Kashmir and the workshops of Germany, the patient Chinaman and the irresponsible polar bear, had alike contributed to those treasures. Among other articles was a small square box, covered with mottled paper and having an outlandish, mysterious aspect, as if it belonged to a magician. When you loosened the catch of this box, possibly supposing it to contain bonbons of a superior quality, there sprang forth a terrible little monster, with a drifting white beard like a snowstorm, round emerald green eyes, and a pessimistic expression of countenance generally, as though he had been reading Tolstoy or Schopenhauer. This abrupt personage, whose family name was Heliogabalus, was known for simplicity's sake as Jumping Jack, and though the explanation of the matter is beset with difficulties, it is not to be concealed that he held a higher place in the esteem of Miss Wentworth than any of her other possessions, not excluding a tall wax doll, fin de siècle, with a pallid complexion and a profusion of blonde hair. Titania was not more in love with Nick Bottom, the weaver, than Mildred with Jumping Jack. It was surely not his personal beauty that won her, for he had none. It was not his intellect, for intellect does not take up its abode in a forehead of such singular construction as that of Jumping Jack. But whatever the secret charm was, it worked. On a more realistic stage than this, we see analogous cases every day. Perhaps Oberon still exercises his fairycraft in our material world, and scatters at will upon the eyelids of mortals the magic distillation of that little western flower, which will make or man or woman madly dote upon the next live creature that it sees. For an hour or so Mildred amused herself sufficiently by shutting Heliogabalus up in the box and letting him spring out again. Then she grew weary of the diversion, and finally began to lose patience with her elastic companion, because he was unable to crowd himself into the box and undo the latch with his own fingers. This was extremely unreasonable, but so was Mildred made. "How tedious you are!" she cried at last. "You dull little old man! I don't see how I ever came to like you. I don't like you any more, with your glass eye, and your silly pink mouth always open and never saying the least thing. What do you mean, sir, by standing and staring at me in that tiresome way? You look enough like Dobbs the butcher to be his brother, or to be Dobbs himself. I wonder you don't up and say, 'Steaks or chops, mum?' Dear me, I wish you really had some life in you, and could move about and talk with me and make yourself agreeable. Do be alive." Mildred gave a little laugh at her own absurdity, and then, being an imaginative creature, came presently to regard the idea as not altogether absurd, and finally as not absurd at all. If a bough that has been frozen to death all winter can put forth blossoms in the spring, why might not an inanimate object, which already possessed many of the surface attributes of humanity, and possibly some of the internal mechanism, add to itself the crowning gift of speech? In view of the daily phenomena of existence, would that be so very astonishing? Of course the problem took a simpler shape than this in Mildred's unsophisticated thought. She folded her hands in her lap, and rocking to and fro, reflected how pleasant it would be if Jumping Jack, or her doll could come to life, like the marble lady in the play, and do some of the talking. What wonderful stories Jumping Jack would have to tell, for example. He must have had no end of remarkable adventures before he lost his mind. Probably the very latest intelligence from Lilliput was in his possession, and perhaps he was even now vainly trying to deliver himself of it. His fixed open mouth hinted as such. The land of the pygmies in the heart of darkest Africa, just then widely discussed in the newspapers, was of course familiar ground to him. How interesting it would be to learn at first hand of the manners and customs of those little folk. Doubtless he had been a great traveller in foreign parts. The label, in German text, on the bottom of his box showed that he had recently come from Munich. Munich! What magic there was in the very word! As Mildred rocked to and fro, her active little brain weaving the most grotesque fancies, a drowsiness stole over her. She was crooning to herself fainter and fainter, and every instant drifting nearer to the shadowy reefs of the western coast of Nowhere, when she heard a soft, inexplicable rustling sound close at her side. Mildred lifted her head quickly, just in time to behold Van de Siècle describe a graceful curve in the air, and land lightly in the midst of her best Dresden china tea set. "Ho, ho!" he cried in a voice preternaturally gruff for an individual not above 5 inches in height. "Ho, ho!" and he immediately began to throw Mildred's cups and saucers and plates all about the apartment. "Oh, you horrid, wicked little man!" cried Mildred, starting to her feet. "Stop it!" "Oh, you cross little girl!" returned the dwarf with his family leer. "You surprise me!" and another plate crashed against the blue-flowered wallpaper. "Stop it!" she repeated, and then to herself, "It's a mercy I waked up just when I did." "Patience, my child. I'm coming there shortly to smooth your hair and kiss you." "Do!" screamed Mildred, stooping to pick up a large Japanese crystal which lay absorbing the wintry sunlight at her feet. When Heliogabalus saw that, he retired to the farther side of his tenement, peeping cautiously over the top and around the corner, and disappearing altogether whenever Mildred threatened to throw the crystal at him. Now Miss Wentworth was naturally a courageous girl, and when she perceived that the pygmy was afraid of her, she resolved to make an example of him. He was such a small affair that it really did not seem worth while to treat him with such ceremony. He had startled her at first, his manners had been so very violent, but now that her pulse had gone down, she regarded him with calm curiosity, and wondered what he would do next. "Listen," he said presently in a queer, deferential way as he partly emerged from his hiding-place. "I came to request the hand of Mademoiselle yonder," and, nodding his head in the direction of Blondella the doll, he retreated bashfully. "Her!" cried Mildred aghast. "You are very nice, but I can't marry out of my own set, you know," observed Heliogabalus, invisible behind his breastwork. This shyness was mere dissimulation, as his subsequent behaviour proved. "Who would have thought it?" murmured Mildred to herself, and as she glanced suspiciously at Blondella, sitting bolt upright between the windows, with her back against the mop-board, Mildred fancied that she could almost detect a faint roseate hue stealing into the waxen cheek. "Who would have thought it?" And then, addressing Jumping Jack, she cried, "Come here directly, you audacious person!" And she stamped her foot in a manner that would have discouraged most suitors. But Heliogabalus, who had now seated himself on the lid of his box, and showed no trace of his late diffidence, smiled superciliously as he twisted off a bit of wire that protruded from the heel of one of his boots. This effrontery increased Miss Wentworth's indignation, and likewise rather embarrassed her. Perhaps he was not afraid of her after all, in which case he was worth nothing as an example. "I will brush you off, and tread on you," she observed tentatively, as if she were addressing an insect. "Oh, indeed!" he rejoined derisively, crossing his legs. "I will!" cried Mildred, making an impulsive dash at him. Though taken at a disadvantage, the mannikin eluded her with surprising ease. His agility was such as to render it impossible to determine whether he was an old young man or a very young old man. Mildred eyed him doubtfully for a moment, and then gave chase. Away went the quaint little figure, now darting under the brass bedstead, now dodging around the legs of the table, and now slipping between the feet of his pursuer at the instant she was on the point of laying hand on him. Owing doubtless to some peculiarity of his articulation, each movement of his limbs was accompanied by a rustling wiry sound, like the faint reverberation of a banjo string somewhere in the distance. Heliogabalus may have been a person with no great